Looks like it's just 2 o'clock now, so hopefully folks will start.
Why don't we just give it another half a minute or so? See if we get a few more people joining us.
Okay.
I see some education committee members, so I'll give a shout out to my colleagues.
I see Dr. Woods, one of my commission members, telehealth services.
Fantastic.
Right. Still coming in, Dave.
We got a few coming in. You want me to wait another minute or so? Yeah, okay.
Looks like it's holding steady.
All right, well, what do you think? Time to get it started and then people join as they come in. So, okay, great. Well, thanks everybody, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. I hope your drive in didn't get too impeded by the snowstorm that we're having. Just kidding. But anyway, I'll start out. My name's Dave Luno, and I chaired the School Funding Commission during the work that resulted in the commission's final report that was issued on December 1st, 2020. And I'm here with commission members Jay Kahn and Mel Myler and Corrine Cascadden, and Bill Artinger and Chris Dwyer are going to join us shortly. And also here with us is our team from the Carsey School of Public Policy at UNH, whose efforts were really indispensable during our year-long effort. And so we've got Jordan Hensley with us, and we've also got Dr. Carrie Portree and Dr. Bruce Mallory. And the plan for today's briefing is to spend a few minutes talking about the commission's work that has led up to some proposed legislation. And then when Bill Artinger and Chris Dwyer will join us for a panel discussion where we can take your questions and have some good discussion on what the commission found and what its recommendations are. So with that, Jordan, how are things generally looking here?
Looking good. As Jay said, we're holding steady, and I have not gotten any emails or calls about folks having trouble with access. So
okay, great. So why don't we get things started then? Is everybody okay with the screen shares coming out all right? Yeah, good thumbs up. All right, super. So we'll start it off with how the commission got started, and basically the commission was formed in the FY 2021 state budget inside House Bill 4, and the charge to the commission was to take a new look at the education funding formula, make recommendations to ensure uniform and equitable design, and determine whether the funding formula complies with our constitutional requirements, look at trends and disparities that we see in our public schools throughout the state, pre-K through grade 12, particularly in view of student performance, and then sort of rounding it out, establish a cost for an adequate education, and really take a look at it from the lens of what how these costs manifest themselves, in terms of adequate education throughout our school districts in New Hampshire. The charge itself led to I think some key questions, and at the top I'd sort of say, essentially, what is an adequate education? What does it cost? And do students across the state have access to an adequate education? And other related questions to that, do school budgets support an adequate education? And I think really, tied directly to that are, do districts have access to the resources they need to fund school budgets that support an adequate education? So for the first time in nearly 40 years, the commission engaged experts, national experts in education funding and in public policy. And it hadn't been done, I don't think, since maybe 1984. And that was really important, because it's really the first time now in nearly 4 decades that we've had an independent team take a look at what we're doing here in New Hampshire, and also provide us with sort of an analysis of what other states are doing for funding education. The committee met, I think, it seemed constantly from January through November of last year. I think close to 100 meetings and over 200 hours of public meetings. And we heard from not only our research team from the American Institutes for Research, but also from a variety of different experts in everything from tax policy, such as the Department of Revenue Administration here in New Hampshire, the Lincoln Land Institute down in Cambridge. We heard from the state treasurer. We heard from municipal and county leaders. We really spent a lot of time with representatives from the Department of Education in really compiling a lot of very New Hampshire specific data. I think we've got 10 years of New Hampshire specific data that was analyzed, and all that went into to what eventually became an independent report that the commission received in August, which led to further work for the commission and our final report in December. So I think a place to start is, what do things look like in New Hampshire right now? And I think a fair starting point is we've got a lot to be proud of. It's just that New Hampshire students on average are performing really well, but that's just not happening everywhere. And it's also important to point out too that in order to get that high level of performance, and this is top 4, top 5 in the country. I mean, maybe right behind Massachusetts, something like that. But local school districts, by virtue of their property tax payers, when they approve school budgets at district meetings, we're spending a lot on our public schools, but we're getting a really strong outcome for that. The twist here, though, is the state support for public education in New Hampshire on a per pupil basis is dead last in the country, lowest in the country. And what that means is and we all know it. I mean, when we knock on doors campaigning, it's the first thing we hear from most of our friends and neighbors. Is the local taxpayer bears the brunt of that burden to fund local schools. So some of the things the commission found was that student performance is strongly correlated with access to to financial resources. So you know, when I say that, think property valuation, because that's how the revenue to fund public education is generated. And so what we're seeing is that districts with lower property values are spending less on average than districts with higher property values. And similarly, districts with these with lower property values, so I'm sort of reading the second bullet upside down here, districts with low property values typically have student outcomes that are 1 or 2 standard deviations below state average. I had actually the chair of the education committee admonished me the other day. He goes, "Luno, people don't know what standard deviation means." So you know, I think people do, but I'll sort of turn that into what most people think of when they think of student performance. But 2 standard deviations below state average is about the 4th or 5th percentile, and you know, I don't think that's anything that most families necessarily feel proud about. But when we look around at how our neighbors in New England are doing, what we're seeing is a different, I guess, appropriation or application of resources in districts that have less property wealth, and what and I'll show that in a second. But I think this is a really important you know, slide to take a look at, because this comes directly out of DOE, you know, 10-year DOE data. But on the x-axis here, we've got the percentage of students that are enrolled in free and reduced price lunch programs. So that's sort of a proxy for poverty. So the higher the incidence, so over here on the right side, the higher the amount of poverty you have in a school district. And the y-axis is the outcome factor. So that's a combination of graduation rate, attendance rate, and scores on standardized tests. So you can see for the areas where there's fewer incidents of poverty, you've got higher student performance on average is higher, and that goes the other way as poverty increases. And here you are right on the floor here, you know, you're at -2 standard deviation. So this is 4th, 5th percentile land. Size of the bubble is size of the district. So Manchester's our biggest school district, 13,000 kids. Here they are sitting on the floor. So here's what that looks like in New Hampshire if you sort of translate that to poverty and spending. So now, same thing on the x-axis, but it's spending on the y-axis, and you can see how New Hampshire has, of all of our neighboring states here, the sharpest declining slope on that. So you compare that to Massachusetts, right below us, where you can see that for districts that have higher incidences of poverty, they actually are applying greater resources in those districts, and indeed that's what our research data, again based on 10 years of DOE data, the analysis shows that modeling on this trend is really the way to look at how to cost education. So that sort of leads us right to our definition for how do we define an adequate education? How do we go about costing? And I'd like to introduce Jay to sort of tell us about what the work that we did in moving from a one-size-fits-all type formula to something a lot more progressive than that. So Jay, can you?
I can do it, Dave.
Great.
So thanks. The input-based formula that we are currently using to distribute our state assistance to school districts is based on a 2008 study and a formula that went into effect then. It distributes a universal reimbursement or education grant per student at $3,709 per student. That is a cost that doesn't exist at any school district on average, nor is it what it's based upon. That doesn't exist at any school either. The three biggest determinants in that $3,709 is based on an accounting formula. And those the standardized ratios, the greatest impact comes from the average class size per teacher. And that's pegged for 4th through 12th grade at 30 students per teacher. It's a ratio that doesn't exist in any school district. In fact, the State Board of Education publishes annually, and their latest report shows that the average is 12 students per teacher throughout the state. There is one district at the high end that has a ratio of 22 students to 1, but again, it doesn't exist anywhere in the state. The second biggest determinant is the average teacher salary, and there it's pegged at a 3rd-year teacher. And we know that that's just not representative of average teacher salaries. And then the third biggest determinant is that the benefits ratio for all full-time staff is pegged at 1/3 of salary. And we know with the downshifting of retirement costs on top of healthcare reimbursements that school districts are looking, as business officers testified to the commission, at a ratio that's much more like 58% of every full-time staff dollar that is spent in school districts. So there's that accounting-based formula. That $3,709 accounts for about $600 million of the total education funding that comes through education grants. The second biggest portion is our stabilization grant, which is $157 million. And that's based on enrollments in 2012. And then there is some differentiated aid. Interestingly, the differentiated aid, it gave us really a clue as to what to look for an outcome-based formula. And outcome-based it begins with what is the actual average cost per student and what's the average outcome per district. And we spend about $17,000 per student and on average in each of our school districts in the state. And we know that that produces the outcomes that David referenced, a pretty good outcome on average. But those outcome scores vary significantly. David showed you the graph. School districts that have higher poverty rates, higher special education enrollments, and a greater percentage of their students who need English learning support, that those three factors account for student needs that lower the average outcome performance in a school district, requiring a higher level of spending than just the $17,000 that we see on average. So there are a couple of community characteristics too that wound up being highly correlated with outcome scores and the cost per district and student enrollment. One is smaller districts just don't have the economies of scale. And the second is that some communities just don't have the capacity to raise dollars and have extraordinarily high tax rates in order to achieve close to the average spending. And yet that average spending, because of their differentiating student populations, actually is insufficient to achieve the average outcomes. And so there's the alternative, a student outcome-based formula that's a student-centered model and arrives at a predicted cost for each school district to achieve the average outcomes for the opportunity of an adequate education. David?
Yeah, no, thanks, Senator Khan. And you know, I don't think we can overstate how bold a change that is, and how we go about defining and costing an adequate education. Because you know, I think we're all, you know, at the end of the day, interested in making sure that our students are doing well and that they're ready to succeed after high school, no matter what their next steps are. And so, you know, being able to determine or being able to predict what a school district should spend in order for their students to achieve a you know, a statewide outcome is really a sea change in how we go about looking at an adequate education and really delivering that opportunity to all of our students across the state. So that sort of leads to the next thing about, you know, what's the state's role in doing this? So just like we had on the adequacy side, we have this on the funding side too. So this is another key difference from our current the current way we do things in New Hampshire. Right now, we sort of conflate costing and funding all into the same thing. Now we're really talking about separating that out. You know, costs are dependent upon the school district and the students they serve, and what we estimate that school district should spend in order to educate their students to a statewide outcome. And so separating out that costing part from the funding part. Some districts are going to need more help from the state. Some districts are going to need less help from the state. And you can sort of see that right now in how that bears out. You know, right now the state's one size fits all funding. You know, it's about $4,600 per student if you start with the base adequacy and tack on sort of our stingy you know, differential aid you know, package onto that. $4,600 per student. The state gives every district that for every student. You know, here you go, good luck, make it happen. And for Brookline to make it happen, it requires property taxes of little of over $22 per thousand. But Newcastle to make it happen, it requires about $2.70 in property taxes. So you can see there's a huge variation, you know, across the state in terms of what the local property taxpayers what the local property tax rates are in order to for those school districts to provide the you know, the education to serve their communities. A real question though is, at what point does it just break, and districts are not going to be able to provide even the you know, an opportunity for an adequate education? And I think we're seeing that in that slide we showed earlier too, where you've got some districts that are right on the floor there, 2 standard deviations below state average. That the big Manchester there spends between local and state dollars about $12,000 to $13,000 per student, compared with the you know, $18,000 to $19,000 per student that most districts are spending. I mean, we've got districts that are spending $25,000 per student, and so you know, here you've got Manchester at half that. So it really draws into the question: do they have the resources they need? So that's where the state comes in. So it starts with a local effort, and everyone's working really hard. but you shouldn't be expected to have to do anything beyond something that's reasonable and proportional. I think that's the Constitution, or that's the Supreme Court language, and the state comes in to get you over to the top. Make sure you got the finances you need to fund a budget for a adequate education. And it's very similar to what's going on in Massachusetts right now. And you know, I'd love to put together a New Hampshire slide on this, but we're not there yet. I mean, we still have a lot of legislative work. So let's use the example from Massachusetts. But you know, each one of these things is basically 100% of a budget to provide an adequate education in these towns in Massachusetts. And you know, let's start over here with Lawrence. And they're working pretty hard on their, you know, local property taxes, but it only generates 5% of what they need. So the state comes in and gets them the rest of the way. Meanwhile, you look over on the other side at Westwood, they're working just as hard as the folks in Lawrence, but wow, their property tax allows them to fund, geez, looks like 80% of their school budget. Massachusetts comes in and gets them the rest of the way. So this is really an equitable model of state funding, you know, versus the sort of the flat, you know, here you go, good luck, that we're doing right now. One of the big things we heard is that even, I mean, it doesn't matter what town you live in. There are people who are struggling to pay their property taxes. And Mel, could I bring you in here to talk a little bit about what some of the things we learned through our public engagement effort?
Yeah, one of the things we did is that as we also heard from a lot of experts, but what we wanted to do from the commission's perspective was to see what was happening out in the field. And we had a chance to have listening sessions, many listening sessions with taxpayers, with municipal and town leaders, with school employees, with elder residents, etc. We also conducted a survey of about 2,000 education employees in 177 local school districts, as well as we had 8 items on the UNH quarterly survey that surveyed about a little over 1,000 people. And some of the results that we got from that, that kind of engagement was that, one, there was a general understanding that there is an inequity in public education, that all students are not having equal educational opportunities. Secondly, that we found out was that there is an understanding of the unequal application of taxes across the state. And in that, as David just said, there is a need to have some property tax relief. The third thing we found out is that the public really does not understand how schools are funded, not at all. The fourth thing we found was that there was a support for the issue of having the funding be student-centered rather than input-centered. The fifth thing that we found out was that particularly from local educators, was that they have a hard time developing their budget to deal with mandates from the state or from the department because of the uncertainty of the funding that's coming from the state. And finally, the one question that we found out that we asked was, what would determine quality education in these folks' minds? And there was clear understanding that the quality of an education is directly related to the quality of the teaching instruction. And that's important because in those locals that are poorer than the others, you have this constant turnover of teaching staff and administrative staff, so there's no continuity in the program development and in the program implementation. So there's a direct correlation between that quality component and the actual funding component within schools. David?
Right. No, thanks very much, Mel. So a lot of data from from grassroots Granite Staters. I mean, forums, stakeholders meetings, but lots of engagement on that, and the commission's recommendations really do factor in the Granite State voice very significantly in terms of forming recommendations that line up with the findings and the research work. And one of the things we like Mel said, one of the things we heard a lot of was, look, there's people in every town that are struggling with property taxes, and clearly we have a tremendous reliance on property taxes. I mean, to the tune of 75% of the $3.3 billion spent on public education. And so it doesn't matter where you live, but the state actually has a program in place designed for property tax relief. It's just way out of date, and it's really not meaningful. And it uses income eligibility requirements that hardly exist anywhere nowadays, and a maximum benefit of $200. And I'm not gonna sniff at $200, but that's not going to really go very far in terms of meaningful property tax relief. So so one of the recommendations is to really revamp the property tax relief program. Put the income thresholds really to focus on low and moderate, with even a emphasis on moderate income, families, and provide a benefit that applies to both the state property tax as well as the local education property tax that has some meaning to it. So looking at about like $1,000 benefit for families who would for homeowners who would qualify. And an area, I mean, we met a lot, like I said up the top, but there are some areas that we really didn't have the time to get into, but the state should take the time to get into, is understand how property tax relief could also extend to people who rent their homes, and also for people who own properties but just have very, very limited cash flow, and so may be able to benefit through tax deferral program. So those I think are some very important considerations coming out of the commission's work. So let's see here. So all this really leads to the school funding reform package. So starting with what defining an adequate education, how to cost it based on students in every district having the opportunity for statewide outcomes and success that are common across the state. It's real high level when looking at the country as a whole, and then making sure that the state plays a meaningful role in making sure that every school district has access to the resources they need to fund the cost of an adequate education. And where they don't, the state comes in, gets them over the top. What's it mean for local property taxpayers? Well, hopefully for most of them, they're going to see some meaningful property tax relief, either because their local property tax rates go down, or because a robust property tax relief program that is specifically put in place for low and moderate income homeowners with up-to-date income eligibility requirements can give them that relief. And then finally putting forth a package of bills that are directed to all these points. And I think what's also important to note, and the last slide, and Jay is gonna talk to it because a lot of this is originating in the Senate. there's a number of bills. There's more than just the ones on the slide. Certainly members of the education the House Education Committee have seen some of these, but they're all part of the package, but they all stand on their own too. And so that's an important thing that I hope all legislators will keep in mind when evaluating different pieces of legislation. So with that, you know, these are sort of the three areas that I think are most significant. Like I said, there's other places too, like school building aid and things. But you know, number one is you know, pandemic stabilization. What are we looking at for school districts for FY22? And then what are we looking at to support change in how we cost and fund our schools FY23 and beyond, and property tax relief? And I'm going to turn it over to Senator Khan to sort of drive us through some of these.
Okay, so starting with Senate Bill 145, and I'll throw out one other bill, which is Senate Bill 135. So 135 passed the Senate this last week. It'll be heading to the House, so I don't want to ignore that is a bill that takes the fall 2019 and the fall 20 census and says that no town should see a decrease in fiscal 22 from whatever the high level was between those two census points. So, you know, there's some school districts that have higher enrollment in fall 20 because of in-migration. But the majority of school districts in the state did see a reduction in enrollment, not just in enrollment, but also in free and reduced meals. Because of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's waiver on meals and qualification for providing free meals to students. As a result, 10,000 fewer parents enrolled in the free and reduced meals, and 8,000 students fewer were enrolled in public schools. Some of that would have been, no matter what, about 1,500 of it, but the rest is you know, tougher to account for. So that's what's done in both 135 and in 145. Where 145 differs, it has to do with fiscal capacity disparity aid. And let me back up one moment. In fiscal 21, the state is providing in education grants a total of $1,024 million. If we follow the 135 bill, it adds 45 million to a low base of 924 million. So 135 and the stabilizing of enrollments in fiscal 22, that brings us up to $960,000. We would need then to consider fiscal capacity disparity aid if we chose, and that's what Senate Bill 145 suggests. That is for low property valuation per pupil towns. Towns that essentially have less than $1 million of property valuation per student. We started around $477,000 this year. It's not Berlin or Claremont, though they're close to the bottom. It's Troy, but there are a whole gamut of towns and cities across the state that have less than that $1 million per student. So it would benefit those towns with $36 million focused at the lowest property valuation communities. And it's a big dollar change for some of those. In Rochester, it's over $3 million, and in Derry, it's 2.8 million. In Manchester, it's 2.5. In towns like Milford and Keene, it's over $1 million. But then there's small towns like Newport or Winchester, where it approaches near $900,000 in those towns. And so 80 towns, it focuses on 80 towns. And what we know from this current year is that this fiscal capacity disparity aid actually helps towns reduce their tax rates. And these are the towns that, David has shown you the graphs, and these are the towns that have extraordinarily high tax rates in order to achieve moderate levels, average levels of funding per pupil. So it works. 63 of those towns this current year actually reduce their taxes. And this focuses in this next year, $36 million again on the neediest towns. When we finish doing that, we still end up saving about $20 million off of the current year's level of spending. So then the next bill that is in the Senate, I'll let Dave come back. You could circle back with HB 623, which is in the House. But Senate Bill 158 essentially looks to the future, fiscal 23, and tries to implement the recommendations that are in the Commission to Study School Funding's report. It looks at the student need characteristics and district characteristics and assigns the appropriate weights that are necessary to evaluate the extra costs that are associated with those student needs or distinctive characteristics that cause the costs in a district to be greater per pupil. It then looks at what is the average spending per pupil, and it takes into consideration the statewide minimum, the statewide property tax, which is around set at $2, which it's very close to what it is in the current year. And it also sets a floor for a minimum local contribution, and that's set at $7.50. So you're essentially looking at focusing state aid on those communities that at $9.50 are covering the full cost of education in their districts, and then allows the state grants to be targeted at those neediest communities, both in terms of student need, tax rates, and community characteristics. There is in there the property tax relief program, and that the state, with its SWEP, would collect the statewide property tax and use that as a statewide revenue source and distribute those dollars as a part of the state education grants, which, by the way, that enables us to fund at $25 million a property tax relief to qualifying homes, which, as David said, needs to increase. And at those increased levels provides a $1,000 grant to 25,000 households in the state that are the neediest. Well, up to, it could be in excess of 1,000 if it's not oversubscribed. So that's the package that's in 158. The bill's been heard in the Senate and no vote yet taken. Chances are we need to continue the conversation around the School Funding Commission. That's a change that needs the input of lots of legislators now to have it make sense for all of New Hampshire. And that's the kind of conversation that we hope this presentation leads to, a more informed conversation, but also one that leads us in a direction that gets us out of this universal price per student that's at nothing that resembles the cost of an education, and gets us to a real cost and tries to target the state distribution to those neediest communities that just are seeing outcomes that are below the state average. In the whole, we're all going to benefit. We're all going to benefit from seeing higher outcomes and spending levels that approach the adequacy for all students in the state. So that's the goal.
Right, right. No, thanks very much, Jay. That's absolutely the goal here, and you know, and it's I don't think it's the first time that the state of New Hampshire has considered, you know, an approach that you know, we're using the term needs based, but you know, I think the decade-old term or 2-decade-old term was probably called targeting, and but basically, how do we use state resources how do we apply state resources where they can be used best and where they're most needed? And you know, we see it done in other, you know, places in education, certainly higher education, you know, does it. But you know, how can we use the limited resources we have and to make sure that we can improve both student equity, number one, student equity, and taxpayer fairness follows that. And that should be something that's in all of our best interest. You know, not just being the right thing to do for all of our kids, but it's the right thing to do for our economy and our businesses and our communities too. You know, I also want to mention here that that there's going to be some new faces on the school funding commission as well. So obviously we're in a different legislative session right now, and I think some appointments were made late last week on that, and I certainly hope the commission will continue to, you know, embrace an equity-based approach, and actually saw some of that in one of the bills in House Education. House Bill 608, which was retained in the committee because I think it still needed a lot of work in terms of running numbers and you know, how to set the dials of all the different parameters in there. It's not easy, but I think it certainly was off to a good start with looking at student equity as being a top priority. So as the commission works and also as the committees, both in the House and Senate, do their work, considering that, I think is real important. We're going to head into I'm going to hand things over to Bruce to take us into the panel. But before I do that, I just wanted to pop this up. I know it's too much information to write down, but the commission's website is carsey.unh.edu /school-funding, and it's sort of on the second bullet here. But from that, you can see the commission's reports, you can see the calendar, you can review meetings, you can look at the research, you can open up data, you can look at a ton of things. There's even a funding, a costing simulator and a funding simulator on there as well. And as we've always been, we're always interested in public comment. And from your constituents, they can send an email to the commission, schoolfunding.commission@unh.edu, and that will continue to be collected. And the Carsey School, my understanding, will continue to be the the keeper, I think, of this very incredible set of materials that's been collected over the past year. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Bruce to start our panel discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions.
Thanks very much, Dave. We will get to questions in just a couple of minutes. We'll invite all the attendees who have questions to post them on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. before we go there, we have a couple of commission members on the call with us who haven't had a chance to be heard from yet. And I'd like to ask each of them to make any additional comments, elaborations, emphasize any points that they'd like to based on their experience with the commission. I know that Corinne Cascadon has to actually go to another meeting at 3 o'clock or switch over to the next Zoom environment at 3. So I'm going to invite Corinne to share anything you'd like to, and then I'm going to ask Bill Artinger to comment as well. But Corinne, if you would start, please. And you're muted.
Yep, thank you. Just to add a little bit to some of the work we did in public engagement, we did hear from taxpayer groups that were very concerned about making sure schools had equitable opportunities for all kids, but really not necessarily increasing the cost. So that was good to know. The senior group also was tried to hammer home that New Hampshire legislators should be looking at the long-term effects of investing in public schools, because it does significantly affect the workforce group in the area. And I think the one that stuck in my mind was the youth group. We involved students from around the state to participate, to see what their level of knowledge, or to get their input. And they really clearly pointed out that it was obvious to them that when they went to one particular school versus another, they distinctly visually saw the differences. And in their mind, they were perceiving it as who had money and who didn't. So that's just from the minds of the kids that walked through those halls. Was pretty interesting, but I definitely encourage you to kind of move this forward. The summary of the report is phenomenal. I mean, you can use the simulator if you want to see specific regions, but one of the things that the commission wanted to hammer home is that we should be thinking not just about my kids, my town, your town, but all the kids in New Hampshire should have the same opportunity. So that's pretty much it for me. I need to zoom out for now.
Thank you, Corinne. And just for those on the call who aren't aware, Corinne is the past superintendent in Berlin for a number of years and led the efforts on the part of the city of Berlin to be sure that they continue to provide the best possible schools they could, given their resources. And most recently was interim superintendent in Littleton as well. So Corinne, we thank you for your service.
Thanks.
And to New Hampshire's kids. Bill Artinger was also a member of the commission appointed by the governor last year, and Bill's been a key thought partner in this process and sort of leading a lot of the analysis for us. And Bill, whatever comments you'd like to make, we'd appreciate. I will ask you at some point, whether you do it now or later on in the call, to also help us understand how you see the commission's findings aligned with the expectations that the courts have expressed over the years in the Claremont cases, the Londonderry case, because the commission was trying to achieve outcomes or recommendations that would meet constitutional muster. That was an important goal for the commission as well. So Bill.
Well, thank you. And I must say that my ability to serve with these commission members and teammates on the commission was one of the most important parts of my career. I enjoyed the work very, very much. I am from Cornish, New Hampshire, and I went to Stevens High School in Claremont, New Hampshire. I met my wife, Cass Spanos, at Claremont High School, and we're still together after all these years. What is important to me about public education is that it is clearly by the numbers the most important priority for this public sector priority in the state of New Hampshire. Of the total $12 billion or so that we spend local government and state government together, $3 billion is state and local, is devoted to our local K through 12 public school system. That is the highest priority measured by dollars of our public sector. But when I see that graph that you all saw, where New Hampshire's allocation of resources leaves communities like Claremont and like in the North Country, Berlin, in a position where they're getting the same amount of state dollars, flat dollars, as other communities that have much greater resources, I see that as a clarion call of something that's broken. And it is very important that the commission's work ultimately came to the conclusion that we have to do work in the state aid distribution formula to give every child, regardless of where they live, in Claremont, in Hanover, in Hampton, or Manchester, an equal shot at a good opportunity for an outcome from their public school system that is fair and just and good. And I would say that I think the commission's work really focused on that, and has come up with, thanks to the leadership of the commission, Senator Khan, Representative Myler, and Representative Luno, and all the commission members really focused on it and came up with an answer. I will say one last thing. I saw Edith Tucker is on the list of attendees today. I want to say that this has gone a long time in New Hampshire, from the 70s, 80s, 90s, 93 with Claremont, 97 with Claremont 2. And I had the opportunity to work in the early 2000s with Senator Fred King from Colebrook, who said we should be focusing our state dollars to help the communities with the greatest need. I want to say we've lost Senator King. He passed away last week, but he was one of the great policymakers that this state has ever known. And on ed funding, he was there with messages that are consistent with the message of this commission. And I hope the legislature, I'm very focused on helping the legislature work together to come up with an answer that finally stabilizes school funding, public school funding, so public schools everywhere, including in Claremont and in Manchester and in Nashua, the places have an opportunity with state support to provide the education to every child. So thank you for the chance to say hi and participate.
Thanks very much, Bill. And I will come back to you on that constitutional question. As an attorney, I know you've looked closely at those matters. However, first, since you mentioned Representative Tucker, she actually has the first question for the panel that she's posed here. And that is, are there any incentives that the commission has put forward to combine school systems that have falling enrollments? And she gives examples of the Berlin-Gorham region, the Pittsburgh-Kohlberg region. And so this question of school district size was discussed some within the commission. And maybe Dave, you want to respond to that? Others.
Sure. So no, that's a really great question, Edith. And you know, I think the commission didn't spend a lot of time looking at either district configuration or you know, elements of curriculum or instruction or things like that. So we did not dive really into education reform. We were really sticking to school funding, and it's a question that I think deserves a lot more attention. Maybe another way to address that too, I think, probably came from Mayor Grenier up in Berlin when talking about potentially, you know, joining forces with other neighboring districts. And I think he sort of said, possibly with a tear in his eye, you know, who would take us? And sorry about that. That's all everyone's used to interruptions during Zoom meetings. But I don't mean that as a slight to Berlin or to any other school, but until you've somehow stabilized school funding in a way that provides some fairness for the students and the taxpayers, it's hard to be able to look very far into the next steps.
Yeah, Bill, you want to add to that?
Yes, I would also say to Representative Tucker's good question, the structure of the system of public education the commission fundamentally respected the local governance structure where the power is delegated to local districts to make governance decisions about that. There are incentives, frankly, in that local governance system to be more efficient. It hasn't maybe existed in the past when, Berlin had the mills, had a tax base, had, a greater number of students. But as districts find that their demographics are such that their number of pupils are declining, there are incentives on local governance processes to work with their neighboring communities to try and come up with answers that are efficient for taxpayers and good education. So the commission did not establish a new kind of top-down set of incentives to force communities to come together, but left in place the existing local governance systems, which actually do have incentives, and those incentives are getting more vigorous and robust as student populations are declining.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to just welcome Chris Dwyer to the screens here. Chris is a member of the commission, was able to join us now as well. Chris, I've invited other commission members to make comments who were able to join us. You're welcome to do that at this point and jump in, or if you want to wait a few minutes and catch up and join us and make it, raise your hand literally or on the screen at any point you'd like to. We have one other question from the Q&A screen, but I'm actually going to ask myself, I'm going to ask our elected representatives, any one of you, Jay, Dave, Mel, to answer a question that I think is on people's minds that hasn't been posed yet, but we've heard a lot of concern from the public and from elected officials about the existing way that we raise revenue in New Hampshire. And so the question has been, why didn't the commission go towards recommending new forms of tax revenue in order to fund public schools and to increase the state level of investment in our schools? If it's the state proportion of investment that the commission finds needs to be distributed in a different way, then why not think about alternative means of raising revenue?
Let me take a part of that. We did have those kinds of questions in our listening sessions. And it was a conundrum because you had people who were saying we need some tax relief, et cetera. But when we raised the question with them, well, let's look at some other alternatives. The conundrum was that nobody could come up with one that everybody could be satisfied with. Further, in the survey that UNH conducted, we did raise those questions. And by far, the response was they didn't want any additional tax incentives. So one of the reasons why we decided as a commission to take the existing amount of money, now don't forget, as David said earlier, this state, as an average, spends a lot of money already on public education. And so we decided that the more prudent way to do this is to take the current funding and allocate it in a fairer fashion. And that really is what the recommendation that the commission has come up with, is to be able to take that fair allocation of funds to help those students in those poorer districts, to help them begin to have the same kind of educational opportunities that other students have. And I also want to mention, lead a little bit more on what Corrine said earlier. We talk a lot in this state about workforce development. Well, workforce development comes from all over the state. It's not just from those wealthy communities. We need to make sure that those students in Derry, in Newport, have the same opportunity. And that's why the title of the report talks about our schools and our kids, all of our kids, not just those students that come from wealthy and well-off communities.
Thanks, Mel. Any other comments on that revenue question? Chris, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, it is a really good question. And those of us who are presumably from wealthy communities may look at it a little bit differently, because we know in our community, for example, we have some wealthy people, we have a commercial tax base, but largely we have middle class and blue collar people when we look at the majority of folks who make up our population. And so the idea that that those folks would be further burdened than they are, because they'd have to raise the money. If money from our community went to another, they'd have to raise the money through taxes to keep our schools at the level that they are, which is about at state average funding. So the challenge of not looking for additional revenue sources is a big one, and I think is one that we know our state has faced for a long time. In addition to that, and I wrote about this in my comment, if we are going to rely on the property tax, the local property tax, then there are a number of fixes, improvements that I think, and I say this as a former city councilor in Portsmouth, that I think are needed to look at our requirements related to the property tax statewide, because there are some built-in issues that that bring about additional unfairness, let alone the unfairness of someone with a very modest income having their property simply become much more valuable under their feet. We would face the loss in Portsmouth of both the elderly population, which we know has always been at risk and has had some tax breaks built into law, but more importantly, I think in some ways to us now, are young families who are feeling very burdened by increases in taxes, exacerbated by the methods that we use, are required to use. We've seen what's happened this year, for example, as property values have just gone through the roof. And even though we reevaluate every year, certainly incomes aren't changing anything like the property value is changing. Perhaps, even though I haven't stressed this so far, the biggest changes that need to be made are fairer valuing of commercial properties. And that's something that the legislature does have an opportunity to make some changes with. I'd also mention the challenges associated with the number of the communities that would be affected and need to raise additional revenues beyond what they currently are doing are the same communities that are affected in other ways by disproportionate effect on, for example, those that have state parks, some that in our case, we have always raised a great deal of the rooms and meals taxes in Portsmouth, yet we get a very little back proportionately. So communities that in other ways are contributing to state dollars are many of the same that would be affected in this case. So I think most of the communities feel that something definitely needs to be done about equity for students, but we also need to keep in mind what we're really doing for equity for taxpayers. It's what Representative Myler said is true. The surveys certainly show that nobody wants to pay more taxes. It's kind of hard to think that the surveys wouldn't show that. But that doesn't mean we don't have to look for some alternate sources of revenue at some point.
Thanks, Chris. Bill, I see your hand is up. Is that current or?
You're
No,
muted.
that's an error. Sorry about that.
Okay, thanks.
I'll put it down.
Thank you. Going back to the questions, and again, those that are listening, attendees, please feel free to post questions on the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Excuse me. So we have a question, and it simply reads, is it important to name legislation this session which would adversely affect legislation that we cited, the commission cited on the slides earlier? And that's a That's a question about what's being put forward to address education matters this session, and any one of our elected officials might be best to answer that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. We didn't really want to make it a focus of this because we really wanted to sort of explain what our findings are and what the legislative package that we're recommending is. But yeah, there are certainly, you know, other approaches to change funding of education. I think some of those certainly are inconsistent with the commission's work, but probably even more, they are inconsistent with a lot of other things too. So I'd sort of defer to you know, the ranking members on the education committees to dive into to those if they'd like.
You know, in that $1 billion or so that we spend a year from state resources, the question is, how much more would it take to either to fund any further distribution of state dollars to other kinds of K through 12 or even early childhood education. We had a mandate in the commission to look at early childhood education. We know that we're only serving about 25 to 30% of our 3 to 5 year old kids in the state with some type of public education opportunity. So you know, you can look on a variety of spectrums, whether that be charter school funding or education savings accounts or tax credits for private education and or early childhood. So we need to there are just a lot of potential draws on the current level of funding and a great need to you know, when we looked at the $3.3 billion that been talked about earlier that we spend on school district educations in the state, that only in this current year 31% of that is covered by state funds. That really is a low level across the nation, the lowest of any state. And you know, if we don't do disparity aid this year the way that we did, I mean, next year, the way that we did in this current year, it's going to drop to 29%, with school districts having to raise their property taxes to compensate for it. So it was important for the commission that we did not hit the button that our recommendations were dependent on a tax increase. They are not. There are a variety of dials here that can be set. It's a matter of how we want to direct the state's resources and determining how much the state is able to contribute, and then turning those dials to a fair system. But spreading our state aid, you know, and it's 177 districts currently. There are 133 private schools in the state. There are 32 charter schools that could rise to 52 if we follow a path in the state. And, you know, it's just a question, how many schools can we support and do an adequate job of providing the same opportunity for all kids in the state?
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that and shift over to a question about what also has stayed in place. In a sense, the work of the commission in the short term is to at least try to hold districts harmless relative to declining enrollments, declining students participating in the free and reduced lunch program, not to suggest any increase in the current taxes that do fund public education at the state level at least. But I also think it's important for attendees and the public to understand that the commission also did not, as was referenced earlier, make any fundamental changes in the statutory definition of adequacy, or make any recommendations relative to all of the components of an adequate education that students are expected to be exposed to, if you will, during the course of their K-12 education, nor did we make any suggestions about changes in standards and regulations, with probably the exception of calling for a uniform, consistent rate structure for public charter schools that are serving students with special education needs, in which the local school district maintains some legal authority and responsibility for those students, even as they go to a public charter school. But I guess Jay or others, if want to comment on what remains in place here. So if people understand that the commission is not blowing up the current system, it's really a matter of looking at how funds are allocated.
No, that's absolutely right, Bruce. And sort of was getting back to what we were saying earlier. You know, this was not an education reform commission. This was an education funding commission. And you know, but obviously it's important to realize that, you know, recognize that New Hampshire students, on average, compared to others in other states, perform really well. So we've got a lot to be proud of in our public school system. How we fund it is not one of those things that we should necessarily be proud of. And a question, and I think this goes to also the question about other bills that might be going through the House and Senate that might be incompatible with the commission recommendations. But you know, questions that I've been asking, you know, go along the lines of, you know, what is this going to do to improve the outcomes for the 13,000 kids in Manchester? What's it going to do in Claremont? What's it going to do in Berlin, Pittsfield, and Newport? I mean, these are things that I think, you know, any piece of legislation that is being marketed as oh, this is really, really important for the state of New Hampshire because it's going to improve equity for kids. I mean, I don't want to, Bill has said this to me, but the way you improve it, and I'm here in Hopkinton, so I'm you know, but what improving equity for kids, if you want to move the needle, you better be seeing it happen in Manchester and Nashua, and certainly other places too. You know, Newport, Claremont, Pittsfield, Berlin. But if you're not looking at our two largest districts that are the two big bubbles in that lower quadrant, then you're not doing much.
Well, what we also found, though, as we looked at other states that moved the lever, use the lever, you know, we're like this, and Massachusetts is like this, they have improved. Where they have put more funding into those areas that have had an inequitable funding opportunity, it has improved over time. Now, there's no magic wand here. So it doesn't, even if we were to do this, take the commission's report and implement it immediately, there's no magic wand. It takes time to undo what has been there for years. But in those states where they have done this, they have in fact found that the students improve, the student outcomes have in fact improved.
Chris, a comment?
Just building on what Representative Myler just said, and Dave's earlier comment, that in those states, most of them have connected reforms with the increased dollars, and the reforms that are particularly targeted at the lowest performing schools, just to assure the public that the investment of new dollars is being managed and monitored in a way that is likely to bring about those outcomes. And I think, you know, we all agree that, as was said, this was not the Reform Commission, but that the State Department of Education would require the backing for some kinds of reforms that would help to ensure public will behind any of the new dollars that were being invested in the lowest performing communities, because those dollars would be substantial for those communities. We know that change doesn't happen overnight, but it is important along the way then to assure the public that there are guardrails for the reforms that are being put in place. And so, we know that those would be subsequent incremental reforms that would have to take place that would accompany the changes.
One other point on that, I think, when we created the input model, that accounting model that we mentioned before, that was all we had to deal with. We did not have the student outcomes in their test scores, et cetera, as we have now. We have a lot of metrics that we can use now. As a matter of fact, it can be used in a way that can hold school districts at a much higher accountable rate than what we've been able to. And so back on what Chris was saying earlier, this is, I think, is a great opportunity for us to be able to not only put our money where our mouth is, but be able to check it, monitor it, so that we can see that improvement. We did not have that in 2008. We didn't have that when we created this earlier. So that's why we're saying this should be a student-centered approach to funding rather than just an accounting approach to funding.
And the commission did also in its report suggest that the Department of Education would benefit from increased capacity to collect data at a more granular level and to update that data, and also to collect data that would align with the kinds of measures that the commission's recommendations suggest. So that would require perhaps some reallocation of state dollars to help the department build that capacity, or some additional revenue that the commission didn't comment on. But in any case, we recognize that related to accountability, the data capacity needs of the department will need to be met. Let's see, we don't have any other open questions at this point. I will ask the question I referenced earlier, Bill or anybody else, help us understand how the commission believes that its recommendations are consistent with the court orders, decisions that came out of the school funding litigation over the past 30 years.
May I start that, Bruce? And just, in 1993, the Claremont 1 court looked at the then school funding system. 8% of the total spent on public education was state dollars at that time in that record. The plaintiffs were some of the property poorest towns and towns with least resources like Claremont, Berlin, Allenstown, Pittsfield. Those towns were getting very little amounts of dollars along with all the other towns. And what the court said is that that situation produced an answer where property taxes were both disproportionate rates and unreasonably burdensome in those plaintiff communities. Well, today, after all that time, we've moved to a system that has a third of our total public education costs paid for with state dollars. That's better than 8%, but 85% of our total state dollars go out on a uniform, fixed, per pupil basis. That is, the town of Hanover, which has got tremendous resources, gets $3,709 per pupil in bulk, and the town of Claremont, which has greater resource challenges, the town I went to school, gets $3,709 per pupil. That cannot be what the court meant when it said to the state executive branch and legislative branch, something's broken in the current system, come up with a way that reduces the unreasonable burdens on these plaintiff communities. The solution that the commission has advocated would go much further to addressing that unreasonable burden aspect of the total system of school funding, because it would direct greater state dollars to the communities that show deficits in their ability to achieve student outcomes that are commensurate with the statewide average. I would say that the difference with the commission's answer, as opposed to the ABC program, the current system based on inputs, is the commission answer creates an integrated, holistic system that looks at the whole of the resources available to create a decent public education in each local district. And by doing so in an integrated manner, including the local required contribution, which for Hanover would be higher than the local required contribution share in Claremont, as Dave Luno's slide of Massachusetts showed, it creates an integrated system that has precedence in other states, including Massachusetts, where their court came out and did their Claremont version in '93, said fix it. The legislature did by using a system, Chapter 70, similar to the commission's recommendation, and their court said, thank you, you're moving in the right direction. I believe as one member, and I'm only one member, and there are other lawyers out there who don't necessarily agree with this, that if the court were presented with an integrated program that's holistically focused on reducing unreasonable burdens in the plaintiff communities and achieving good results for every child across the state, regardless of where they live, the court would say the legislature and the executive branches are moving in the right direction. The one place I would say that, there continues to be a concern is the current statewide property tax system is providing essentially differential rates. Some communities aren't required their taxpayers to pay in the same state property tax dollars as the other. I think that the commission's recommendation that is now reflected in Representative Ames' House Bill 504 would address that exposure to legal challenge. And I think, so in general, I think the commission answer has provided a solution that is holistic, it's integrated, it's well-focused on the plaintiff community's ultimate concerns. And I think that if we were able to put it into law, the court would be supportive of the efforts that that is one lawyer, and it's very dangerous to predict how a court will come out. But you asked me as a member of the commission, and I thought I would answer directly.
Thank you, Billy. You always do. Any other comments on that? Okay, we're going to a question directed at Representative Myler in reference to, I think, the point you made a minute ago, Mel, about the results of the changes in education funding in Massachusetts and other states. And the question is, in the states that have seen positive results in educational outcomes, have their property taxes leveled to a point where the public is content? And Mel, you can take the first shot at that. Anybody else?
I do not have the answer to that question.
I'm not sure that the public is ever content about
Yeah, right. Exactly.
whatever.
I don't know. Maybe perhaps Chris might have a little more information.
I don't know if they're content. I do know in those cases, unlike in our state, they have been able to find, remember, those are states where there are multiple sources of revenue, for one thing, and they have been able to find ways to build into the tax due the ability to pay, even within local property taxes, Vermont system, Massachusetts system. So they have taken into account resource income assets into the amount of property tax due. So that may lead to some more content, at least among some segments of the population.
If I could, again, cite Senate House Bill 504 pending in front of the House Ways and Means Committee. The commission you know, one of the greatest sources, everybody, the great Senator Russell Long from Louisiana said, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the fellow behind the tree. Why? Because nobody likes to pay taxes. That's the general rule is that, and Chris has kind of alluded to that. However, the difficulty with the current property tax system as it applies to local public school finance is that in New Hampshire, we have not pursued robust relief mechanisms that would provide relief to those with the lowest incomes or lowest cash flows. House Bill 504 proposes to make those more robust. It is, you know, if you think about the folks who would come to town meeting and complain the most about property taxes, it's not the people who have higher incomes or higher net worths. It's the folks who are struggling with lower incomes and lower net worth. Massachusetts, as Chris said, has more robust systems. And I think the Ways and Means Committee, the other day I was at a hearing on Representative Ames' bill. It looks like they're going to have work sessions that try to focus on that part of the Education Funding Commission's recommendation to make those property tax relief mechanisms more effective.
Thanks, Bill. Again, no other pending questions. There is a comment on the Q&A relative to what's come up here in this conversation and elsewhere, of course, and that is this notion that property taxes raised locally as part of the state property tax would then be allocated out in a way that would provide less resourced communities with additional resources. And in some ways, you could, if you put a die mark on your property tax dollar and you trace that property tax dollar through the system, you might find that it lands in another community to contribute to the school budget in another community that doesn't have the same level of resources as your own community. So this is a dynamic that's part of the conversation and part of New Hampshire's history of school funding, and is certainly going to be addressed in the legislative sausage. Yeah, Bill.
If I could, you know, it's interesting. Every tax we have, Chris mentioned this, the meals and rooms tax, paid for, you know, in larger shares by communities that have tourist sectors or restaurants or hotels. The interest and dividends tax, paid for by community. The community is not the taxpayer. The individuals who are subject to the tax are the taxpayers. And I think that the concept of a donor towns, they don't pay taxes. It's the taxpayers who do. And so almost every tax system could be criticized as, hey, you're putting more money into the state budget and then we're getting out. And you know, we heard, you know, at the federal level, states like New York argue that. I think that it's missing the point. The point is we need resources to support public goods like our public schools, which have supported in a crass way, workforce development, in a more passionate way, giving children of our state, and Mel Myler said this the best, they're all our children. I live in Concord now, but you can be darn sure that as a member of this commission, I am going to support and advocate for giving children in Claremont and in Manchester and in Nashua the same chance that the children in Portsmouth, Concord, Hopkinton, you know, you pick it. We you know, the fact that that kind of claim that there's this donor count concept, it exists with every tax, and I think we have to get over that and address it directly. And I think the commission's work was moving down that path.
So we have one comment on the Q&A. No outstanding open questions. Is there anything else that members of the commission want to be sure to emphasize? We're scheduled to go until 4 o'clock. We'll keep things open until then as we need to. But if we also don't have any further questions,
Yeah.
we can-
Yeah, let me say one thing. I
Additional-
think
No.
one of the things the commission tried to do was to lay a foundation for a look at school funding in a way we've never looked at it before. We recognize that this is a long-term effort here. It's not going to happen overnight. I mean, if you go to the website, it is rich, it is robust. If you have any questions about school funding, it's on that website. It's never been done before. And so as we began to look at this, I think, at least for myself, I recognize that this is not an overnight kind of a change, but hopefully the commission has really laid a marker down for us to look at this as a whole state community in a way we've never looked at it before. And then as we go down the road here, we'll be able to reflect on the work of the commission as an alternative way of becoming more constitutionally aware of what has been said in the last decisions, as Bill so appropriately outlined. So I think for me, it's a long-term effort. It's not an overnight thing. Jay has presented in his bills in the Senate. He's put his marker down for the commission in the Senate for them to at least have a conversation to create. We wanted to create an informed dialogue around school funding because we recognize that most don't have a clue how it's done. And so hopefully the commission has provided that foundation so that a road can be taken place that you can have an informed conversation about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel.
I'd just like to add at this point and recognize it was Mel's legislation that brought the commission to life. And, they're recognizing that we've had these conversations about how to fund schools in the courts and in the legislature for a dozen years. And we need to have a better basis on how to distribute the dollars that we have to try to make sure that the statutory obligations in the state, the opportunity for an adequate education for all kids is met. That's our goal. So I gotta appreciate Mel. Thank you for bringing this forward. You gave us a great opportunity to talk about it. And then thank David for just having the passion to want to lead this effort. And it took a lot of work, and we all needed to drive ourselves through the funnel and see if we could hit the mark with a set of recommendations that provided a basis for the legislature to follow that path. And I think we did. And it will be hashed out, but hopefully not over multiple, 2-year elected terms. We got to come to grips with this so that our communities can make the transitions that are needed to provide a more equitable distribution across the state and achieve higher outcomes. We're all going to do better when the lower performing districts start to rise up to the average performance in the state. And that's going to make New Hampshire stand out even more clearly among the states in the nation with the outcomes that we achieve.
Yeah, no, Jay, I think you and Mel are absolutely right on that. And thanks for your kind words on the commission work. I appreciate all of you for the effort you've put in to it. Everyone on the commission, I think, brought a different background, a different perspective, a different understanding of things. And I know, just speaking for myself, looking back on when we got started, I forgot the day, January 13th, 2020, it was something like that. And that was 200 hours of Zoom meetings ago. And but I certainly couldn't have predicted back then where we ended up in our December first report. So I think that by itself has a lot to do, I think, with the integrity of the work, the importance of the research, the data collection, the analysis, and the support and the collaboration, I want to say, that we had among commission members, as well as with the with Bruce and Kerry and Jordan, and with Jesse Levin and Drew Atchison and the team at the American Institutes for Research. It was a very, very strong team effort, and I'm just, proud and really honored to even be part of it. But ultimately, successful legislation is what is what we're all looking for, and I think anything to be successful is going to have to be durable, and for it to be able to stand that test of time, whether that's 10 years or 20 years, but it's something on that time frame. Is going to have to be bipartisan. It's going to have to be collaborative. It's going to have to be something that is developed using using all of our resources to do it. And I think hopefully I think we're off to a good start on this. We certainly understand the difficulties that a pandemic session presents on doing anything of this sort of magnitude, but at the same time, I think our Zoom meetings helped us along too, and it in some respects meant that we had to keep our calendars free constantly throughout the year to meet, but I think there was a lot of attention to detail, and there's going to have to we're going to have to continue in that fashion.
Thanks, Dave. I'll again invite attendees. Any final questions? We appreciate your comments. Thanks for the good words as well. I think this has been a useful opportunity for our elected colleagues to get a deeper understanding of the commission's work, the rationale behind its findings, and to answer a few questions along the way. Again, feel free to send queries to the school commission email that was posted earlier in chat. And best wishes to all of you as the legislative session continues.
Thank you, Bruce.
Great. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Bruce, Jordan, and Carrie,
Thank
team.
you, Bruce,
And
team.
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for all attending.